Sean Diddy Combs has just filed a brand new bid to get out of jail before his sentencing in a few months. From arguing he shouldn't be locked up for his swinger lifestyle, to highlighting the atrocious conditions at the MDC, to addressing allegations of violence, he is fighting for his life in this new letter to the judge. Could it work?
Diddy's downfall had been years in the making, but it became undeniable when the judge read his prison sentence aloud. For decades he lived as if untouchable, building an empire through music, fashion, and celebrity influence, protected by wealth and status, and appearing immune to scandal until that final moment changed everything forever for him.
Team behind the scenes, I'm going to get to that a little bit later, but what I want to talk about right now is this latest letter from the defense to the judge overseeing this case, Judge Arun Subramanian. Remember, this comes after a jury of Combs' peers found him not guilty of racketeering conspiracy, not guilty of 2 counts of sex trafficking, but they did convict him of 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. He's set to be sentenced on October 3rd. Technically, he could face up to 10 years in prison on each charge. Highly unlikely. Think maybe you might be looking at somewhere to 2 to 5 years potentially, but he could also get time served and be released, although that also seems unlikely. I'll talk about that a little bit later too. But initially, after the verdict, right after the verdict, his defense team petitioned the court that he should be released. He was just acquitted of some very serious charges. The judge denied it. The judge denied Combs bail once again. And remember, this comes after he was rejected bail multiple times since he was arrested back in September of 2024, highlighting the severity of the charges, the violence, and so forth. But now, this is different. Now, what is the defense arguing? I'm going to go over all this in the new letter. I'm going to give my take at the end about whether or not it's going to be successful and whether or not he will actually be released.
Anger took over as the reality of his situation crashed down on him. He shouted, cried, and lashed out, unable to accept the fate being sealed in that room. Long before the sentence was read, the courtroom was heavy with tension. Journalists filled every row alongside family members, alleged victims, and powerful industry figures, all waiting for the ruling that would define Diddy's future. Months of testimony and evidence had stacked up, revealing a disturbing portrait of a man accused of using wealth and influence to conceal the darkest parts of his private life. His attorneys pleaded for leniency, pointing to his career achievements and cultural impact as reasons for mercy. The judge rejected that argument outright, making it clear that fame, money, and status offered no protection from the law. When the sentence was finally announced, the room fell into stunned silence. That silence shattered almost instantly as Diddy erupted in fury. Witnesses later described the scene as unreal. A man known for controlling his image and commanding every narrative suddenly lost that control completely. He slammed his hands on the table, shouted at the court, and refused to process what was happening. His legal team tried to restrain him, whispering for calm and composure. But the anger spilled out anyway, raw and public, exposing a side of him the world.
Reasons. What are those circumstances that are exceptional? They highlight several things that we're going to get into. That the charges he was convicted of, we're going to call them the Mann Act violations. That's what it's called under the law. They're not as severe, they're not as egregious as other convictions in other cases. That the sheer fact that he's locked up at the MDC, the Metropolitan Detention Center, for the past 11 months, that in and of itself is a reason for him to be released. These are all exceptional circumstances, and I'm going to get into all the arguments. But first, they highlight the standard, and they argue that to be released under federal law, you need to show 2 conditions. First, the district court must find by clear and convincing evidence that the person is not likely to flee or pose a danger to the safety of any other person or the community if released. Second, it must be clearly shown that there are exceptional reasons why such person's detention would not be appropriate. Now, clear and convincing evidence is a lower standard, by the way. It's not like beyond a reasonable doubt. Anyway, basically, you have to show he's not a flight risk, he's not a danger, and you have to show there are particular, exceptional, unique reasons for why detaining Combs is wrong. We're going to start with the exceptional reasons justifying his release. And they begin by trying to define, well, what exactly is exceptional circumstances? What does that mean? And they argue that case law suggests a court has a lot of discretion to determine whether a particular set of circumstances qualifies as exceptions. And they say, look, Sean Combs, his case, so different from other ones. There has never been, according to them, a Mann Act prosecution like this one before. And this is how they lay it out. Quote, there has literally never been a case like this one, where a person and his girlfriend arrange for adult men to have consensual sexual relations with the adult long-term girlfriend as part of a demonstrated swingers lifestyle and has been prosecuted and incarcerated under the Mann Act. Combs and 2 of his longtime girlfriends had a private, intimate life that is not uncommon today. They're talking about Jane and Cassie Ventura. Quote, "It may not have been common on June 25th, 1910, when the Mann Act, or as it was originally called, the White Slave Traffic Act, was passed, but attitudes about sex and morality have come a long way in the last 115 years. It is worth noting that when the Mann Act was passed to protect the morals and decency of America's women were not allowed to vote. As noted below, perhaps due to the troubling background of this statute, whose history is rich with both racism and misogyny, the Department of Justice has limited its application to those people profiting financially from the business of prostitution and not using it to prosecute consensual adults for their own lifestyles." By the way, we covered this on a previous sidebar. The defense made an argument months ago to have these charges thrown out, called it basically racially motivated, that it was strange that it was being used against a successful black man. That argument didn't work. He was ultimately
This was not the polished figure seen on red carpets or award stages. This was a man confronting the collapse of everything he built, powerless to stop it. The sentence itself has been described as shocking and deeply unsettling, not only because of its length but because of the message it sends. For years, many believed someone like Diddy was untouchable. His wealth, his name, and his connections acted as armor against real consequences. That illusion shattered as the judge spoke. Ruling made one thing unmistakably clear. The truth had finally caught up and no empire was too large to face judgment. This moment represents more than a legal loss. It marks the destruction of an entire legacy. Diddy's career was crafted around success, excess, and control. He presented himself as a mogul, a tastemaker, a businessman who turned influence into a global brand. Parties, luxury, and power became inseparable from his image. Now those images carry a permanent stain. Every award, deal, and public triumph is overshadowed by what emerged from the courtroom. History will no longer remember only the music or the money, but the consequences of decisions made in private. Central to this outcome were the individuals who came forward. Their accounts were detailed, emotional, and impossible to dismiss. For years, they lived with fear and silence, believing their voices would never matter. This ruling proved otherwise. It signaled accountability and a shift many once thought would never arrive here.
In addition, Mr. Combs is incarcerated while everyone else involved in this identical conduct, his girlfriends, the cowboys, the agency leaders, the porn stars, and others, walk free, as they should. If there was ever a fact pattern that was exceptional under the Mann Act, it is this one. And then they move on to another argument, that the Department of Justice, the DOJ, has usually only charged Mann Act violations when there's financial gain. And they even cite a number of cases in the Southern District of New York, where Combs was prosecuted, that apparently involved defendants that set up a prostitution business for profit. Again, trying to distinguish between Combs' conduct and these cases. He never did any of this for profit, they argued. And they even cite the 1953 U.S. Attorney's Manual that says, quote, "As a general rule, prosecution should not be instituted in the so-called non-commercial cases." And they claim the Department of Justice manual today, quote, "makes clear that the prosecution of customers involved in an 18 U.S.C. 2421 offense, like Mr. Combs here, is now limited to prosecuting those who engage in commercial sex with victims of sex trafficking, in addition to those who otherwise perpetrate or facilitate human trafficking offenses." And in the absence of any sex trafficking charge, however, it is clear that the standalone Mann Act counts never would have been prosecuted. That seems true. I think you ask any legal expert, they will say if all the government had against Sean Combs was the transportation to engage in prostitution charges, just the prostitution charges, they probably wouldn't have gone after him. They coupled it with racketeering and they coupled it with sex trafficking. I agree with that. I don't think that they would have gone after him just for that. Anyway, the defense highlights how modern day prosecutions of Johns is really when you're talking about exploiting vulnerable foreigners who don't speak English well, which again is not the case here. And they highlight how the only potentially comparable case in New York is where you had a retired police officer and a former judge who apparently hired women to have sex with a male fraternal group called the Jesters. But Combs' attorneys say, while there was no profit there, there's no profit here, there was sex trafficking of those prostitutes. That's what's different. Again, Combs was acquitted of sex trafficking in this case. And here's the main point, quote, "Moreover, the cases which involve defendants similarly situated to Mr. Combs, have been released on bond pending sentencing. In reviewing the cases across the country where the primary or sole conviction was for a violation of 18 U.S.C. 2421, the defendants who were not charged with running a prostitution business have been released pending sentencing. And then Combs' attorneys make another argument for why Combs' conditions are exceptional. And it's about him being locked up at the MDC. They say that a district court judge in the Southern District in another case basically said how bad the MDC is. As Judge Furman noted, the state of affairs at MDC is unacceptable. In so noting, Judge Furman concluded that the conditions in the MDC qualify as exceptional reasons under the statute, justifying, and this was the defendant in this case.
And the judge's decision reflected that reality. Diddy's tears and rage could not erase what had been exposed. Once the silence cracked, the truth rushed out, too large and too loud to ever be contained again. In many ways, his downfall represents a broader turning point within the entertainment industry. For decades, powerful men operated with near total impunity, shielded by fame, money, and influence. They built systems designed to protect them, surrounding themselves with people who benefited from their power and chose not to ask questions. Those structures depended on fear, loyalty, and silence. Now those protections are starting to fail. The sentence handed down was not only about one man, it served as a warning to anyone who believes success makes them untouchable. No matter how high someone rises, the truth has a way of dragging everything into the light. The anger displayed in court was about more than the years he now faces. It marked the collapse of an identity. He was no longer a mogul directing the narrative, no longer the architect of his own myth. He stood as a defendant, listening as his life was measured in years of confinement. For someone who thrived on control and dominance, that loss was devastating. His outburst was not simply rage. It was desperation, fear, and the realization that escape was no longer possible. What deepens the impact of this moment is the reaction from the industry itself. For years, many peers stayed quiet, unwilling to challenge his influence. Some feared retaliation. Others feared losing access, money, or protection. Now that silence is fracturing, conversations are happening behind closed doors, questions are being asked, and people are reassessing how far this culture of protection truly reached. The consequences will reshape power dynamics long after this verdict fades.
Meaning Diddy, let's say he gets 5 years in prison, Trump pardons him, he's free to go? President Trump was asked about this a few months ago before the verdict. This was back in May. And he said when asked about a pardon for Diddy, I would certainly look at the facts. If I think somebody was mistreated, whether they like me or don't like me, it wouldn't have any impact on me. He used to really like me a lot, but I think when I ran for politics, that relationship busted up from what I read. I don't know, he didn't tell me that, but I'd read some little bit nasty statements in the paper all of a sudden. And Diddy had been photographed with Trump over the years. There was some sort of relationship there. President Trump even called him a good friend on a 2012 episode of his TV show The Apprentice. The problem is, some comments Diddy made about Trump in recent years as Diddy really entered the political realm. There's a video where he's speaking to radio host Charlemagne saying, if Trump gets elected, I really do believe in my heart there'll be a race war. In another video on Revolt, he says white men like Trump need to be banished. And by the way, you know who's not letting anyone forget this? Combs' rival 50 Cent. Took to social media recently, wrote, see, Trump don't like S like this, buddy. You run your mouth too much. And Donald doesn't take well to disrespect and doesn't forget who chooses to go against him. While working tirelessly to make America great again, there is no room for distraction. He would consider pardoning anyone who was being mistreated, not Puff Daddy. And let me tell you, the idea of Trump pardoning Diddy is not getting a ton of love out there. Conservative commentator Megyn Kelly posted on X, Trump should not pardon Diddy. He doesn't deserve it. He's a Trump hater. He's a woman abuser. MAGA is already upset over elites seeming to cover for each other. This would not help. GOP struggling with young female voters, most of whom will hate a Diddy pardon. And then you just had other random accounts like America First. What? He's actually considering this? Diddy is a depraved, abusive, sexual deviant who should be spending the rest of his life in prison. If Trump pardons him, he will get absolutely crushed. Who is advising him lately? It's looking like straight up sabotage at this point. There were other accounts that were not in favor of it, although there was this account, Milo, posted on X. Trump has no choice but to pardon Diddy after the government, led by James Comey's daughter Maureen, simply lost interest in Diddy's guilt the moment they secured his tapes incriminating powerful Democrats. The prosecution was a shambles. The trial was a farce. Now, I want to talk about if this is really going to happen, how it would happen. Also, if it really depends on bail and sentencing, then what are we talking about? And I have somebody who not only has been following the Diddy case from the very beginning, not only is a renowned criminal defense attorney, but actually has obtained federal pardons from the president, including from Donald Trump, By the way, for his clients Kodak Black and Lil Wayne, those were maybe the most notable, I'm joined by Bradford Cohen. Bradford, thank you so much for coming here on Sidebar. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Jess.
Now, before I even get into the pardon, okay, there was a bit of breaking news before we were going to come on. This is what I want to get your opinion on first. So Combs' defense team filed a memo in support of a motion for judgment of acquittal, or in the alternative, a motion for a new trial. And basically, I know you read through it, but basically the evidence, they would say, is insufficient to sustain that conviction. Their main arguments is really echoing what we've talked about a little bit when it came to the bail analysis, but that his prosecution, his conviction on these Mann Act prostitution charges is so unique. He wasn't profiting off of this business. All consenting adults were involved. The jury didn't find that there was any sex trafficking. They argued this isn't even prostitution per se, it's voyeurism, that the intent wasn't for people to travel for sex for money, but he paid them for their time. Everybody was having a good time.
Diddy's collapse may only be the beginning of something much larger. His downfall feels like the first domino in a chain reaction that could stretch far beyond what most people expect. The impact is already spreading. Fans are deeply divided. Some are still in shock, struggling to accept that someone they admired for decades could fall this hard. Others believe this moment was inevitable and long overdue. For a younger generation that only knew Diddy as a wealthy mogul and cultural icon, the revelations are difficult to process. For those who have heard rumors quietly circulating for years, this feels like confirmation. No matter where people stand, one thing is undeniable. This is a turning point. Even as his legal team prepares appeals, the damage is permanent. His empire is unraveling in real time. Business partners are stepping back, brands are distancing themselves, and his name is now permanently tied to scandal and disgrace. No achievement, no award, and no past success can erase the image of him breaking down in court as the sentence was read. That moment will define him more than anything else. The unsettling truth is that Diddy never believed this day would arrive. He built his empire convinced that influence and money could solve anything. That belief was his greatest mistake.
Was enacted because of a racist motivation that white women were being recruited by people of color to go across state lines and make money. So actually pimping those women across state lines and making money off of their sexual exploits. Obviously, that's not the case here. It's used so infrequently, it might have been a handful of people were actually charged with the Mann Act. No one in custody currently has ever been convicted of the Mann Act. So it's an interesting argument to say, hey, listen, this Mann Act, the original reason for it was racist. The original way that it was applied was racist. The way it's applied here is incorrect because he was not making any money from quote unquote pimping or getting these women across, or men getting them across state lines. None of that was being done. This was all being done for entertainment purposes. So it's an interesting argument. I don't think this judge buys it. It might be interesting on an appeal, but I don't think the judge is going to give him a judgment of acquittal on those two counts based on the argument. Now, the more interesting argument to me, and it's their last argument for new trial, is that, listen, if you were just going to charge him with these two counts, which I originally said when I looked at all the evidence, and don't forget, I was getting calls during this trial from individuals that were telling me, hey, I have information that exonerates what they're saying against Sean Combs, essentially saying that Cassie and others were participating more than just having sex in a room. They were participating more than that. They were paying people, they were hiring people, they were sending me pictures even when Diddy wasn't around. They were asking me to come over even when Diddy wasn't around. These were what these witnesses were telling me, which is really Brady evidence. And I don't know if that was ever turned over. But the more interesting argument is that all these counts were charged. The only thing he was convicted of were the Mann Acts, and he probably wouldn't have been convicted of these Mann Acts but for all this other stuff that came in to try and prove these counts that they could not prove and did not have a basis for bringing.
Let me just challenge you on that, because this is a jury who didn't find that there was sex trafficking, and I can't confirm that they found him guilty of the Mann Act because of the hotel video or anything else. I mean, it seems to me that they might have convicted him on that based on the travel records, the payment receipts, all about that. Not even necessarily allegations of violence. I mean, do you think that it was because of, let's say, the Intercontinental Hotel video that he was convicted of transportation to engage in prostitution? It always felt to me that they proved that charge based purely on, the documents.
Well, I always feel like during a trial, whenever you get a guilty verdict on one of the counts or two of the counts out of 6 or 7.
His outburst in the courtroom revealed a man who felt betrayed by a system he once believed he controlled. What he failed to realize is that power does not protect someone forever. Justice may move slowly, but it eventually arrives. This moment is historic, not only for hip-hop, but for the entire entertainment industry. It represents the collapse of one of its most influential figures and forces a difficult question into the open. How many others have been shielded in the same way? The judge's sentence sent a clear message. The walls built around men like Diddy are not unbreakable. They can stand for years, even decades, but when they finally crack, everything falls at once. For Diddy, the future now looks nothing like the life he once flaunted. Prison walls replace private jets, luxury homes, and unchecked power. His anger, his tears, and his refusal to accept the verdict will not change that reality. A man who once seemed untouchable has become a warning. Proof of how quickly an empire can collapse when it is built on secrecy and abuse. His breakdown in court was not just rage. It was the realization that the world had shifted and his influence no longer mattered. When the verdict came down, reactions were sharply divided. Some compared the public response to the O.J. Simpson case. Many were furious with the decision, while others openly celebrated it. The split reaction raises one final question. What do you think this verdict truly represents?
Verdict happened. But I know some analysts were kind of comparing it to the O.J. Simpson verdict, but it seemed like the reaction was really kind of split down the middle. A lot of people upset with the jury's decision, but then there were a lot surprisingly celebrating the verdict. What are your thoughts?
Well, my entire time looking at the case, the charges, and listening, to the evidence as it came in during trial, I thought that depending upon how a person, be it a juror, be it the public, comes into the trial believing how someone who's a victim should act and how they believe relationships can evolve or devolve and fall apart is the lens that they would then make their verdict. Why I say that is because if you think a person who's battered, someone who's been a victim, someone who's been assaulted in the ways that were described, most people have an idea as to how they will respond and act towards that, or their expectation if it happened to their loved one, how they'd expect their loved one to act. And in those situations, you don't expect someone to be tweeting. You don't expect somebody to be sending texts telling their abuser that they love them or that they want more of what took place. However, there are other people who see it from maybe more so the lens of a victim or someone who's been abused, who would say, you know what? That's not so beyond the pale of reason, because the abuse has been so entrenched in this person's mind that they then fall in love with their abuser. And so that's not something that they would, look askance upon or look down upon. So, one of the things about being in trial that I always remind my clients, is that despite all the rules that the judge gives people, no one leaves their life experience or their opinions at the courthouse door. It all makes its way into the courtroom and ultimately into the jury room. And that's why you can see such people who are on one side, like celebrating Diddy being acquitted on the much more serious charges, and other people who are like, how did this happen? I am upset. I feel like victims did not get justice today.
Right, exactly. And emotions did run really high, especially when the verdict came down, because I think I myself was pretty surprised at some of the jury's decisions in relation to some of the charges where they found him not guilty. But, obviously they made their decision. They listened to the evidence. They saw all the exhibits and they made the decision that they did. And say come sentencing that Sean Combs is sentenced to maybe a couple years behind bars in prison. But do you think even after this trial, after everything that we've learned, after the many civil lawsuits that were also filed, do you think that there's any type of way that Sean Combs can have a comeback at this point?
Well, I think there's certainly a comeback that could be crafted and created, in which we as the public may see. Listen, this is a person who has lived his life in the public light, in the limelight, for decades. Okay. And so, as has been said before, fame is one of the more addictive or most addictive drugs known to man.
Diddy's legacy will never fully recover. His music, businesses, and role in shaping culture will still be remembered, but they will always exist in the shadow of what was finally exposed. What once looked like a story of ambition and success has become a narrative of disgrace and accountability. The man who symbolized power and influence is now remembered as a warning. As he begins his time behind bars, the world is forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. No empire lasts forever when it is built on silence, fear, and control. This moment marks the end of an era not only for Diddy but for the culture that protected him for so long. The sentence handed down has permanently altered his life and sent shockwaves far beyond his own downfall. The tears, the anger, and the rage seen in that courtroom were the final collapse of someone who believed he was untouchable. In the end, the truth caught up, the illusion shattered. Injustice, long delayed, finally spoke.